Brian, are you crazy? Did you really go behind Doris's back and give her bone marrow to Ethel? At a private hospital in Los Angeles, Grace hurriedly entered the hospital room, pointing at Brian sitting on the sofa and scolding him. Brian tilted his head back slightly, his handsome face furrowed, his voice helpless. Sis, only Doris and Ethel had a successful bone marrow match. I had no choice. Grace picked up the report on the table. Doris had been hospitalized for over half a year due to infection, glanced at it, and was furious. No other way, you clearly knew Doris was in poor health, yet you lied to her, telling her it was a stomach issue, and let her take this risk. I just find it bizarre. Did Ethel cast a spell on you? Back then, you went racing to win her smile and ended up paralyzed for 5 years. It was Doris who stayed by your side all that time. Now that you've recovered, Ethel got sick, was dumped, and returned to the country. You hid it from Doris and gave her bone marrow to Ethel. Half a year later, as soon as Ethel recovered, you're indulging her whims and accompanying her to undergo IVF. At the hospital room door, Doris had just finished the discharge procedures when she heard Grace's angry words. Her hand, which was resting against the wall, suddenly tightened, the smile on her face froze, and she felt as if she had fallen into an icy abyss. Half an hour ago, the doctor had informed her that her postoperative stomach infection had completely healed and she could be discharged. Brian had proposed to her on the spot. She had been so happy she cried and even posted on social media, saying it was the happiest day of her life. In the hospital room, Brian lowered his head, his fine black hair covering his dark eyes, making his expression unreadable. Sis, please help me keep this under wraps. Don't let Doris know. Ethel's grandmother doesn't have much time left. Her only wish is to hold her child before she passes. I don't want her to have any regrets. Grace widened her eyes, her beautiful, delicate face filled with anger. What about Doris? Everyone in our circle knows she's had feelings for you for a full 8 years. I remember it clearly. 8 years ago, Ethel confessed her feelings to Clay and got rejected. You, wanting to get back at him for Ethel, deliberately approached Doris and flirted with her, just to make Doris's admirer, Clay, feel miserable. Now Ethel is pregnant, and Doris has been with you for 8 years. What are you going to do about her? Brian lowered his gaze, and after a long moment, he replied in a hoarse voice, I've already made arrangements. Doris will never find out about Ethel's pregnancy. As for the future, I've grown used to having her around these past 8 years. I will marry her. Doris didn't listen to the rest of the words. The nurse happened to be walking towards the ward, and Doris lowered her head, looking as if she had just returned. The two people in the ward looked at each other with furrowed brows, and Grace pulled Brian away. On the way home, Brian and Doris discussed the details of the wedding. But Doris didn't take in a single word. She watched the receding skyscrapers outside the window, feeling a chill run through her entire body. She first met Brian when she was 15, at a gathering hosted by her parents and their business partners. That fleeting glimpse of the young man's aloof and noble demeanor lingered in her mind ever since. At 16, she participated in a racing competition and saved Brian's life, beginning a long and unrequited love. At 20, Clay pursued her, and that same year, Brian attended her friend's party, where he took the initiative to add her that night. That night, she was happy the entire evening. That same year, she learned that Brian had a childhood friend, Ethel. However, Ethel was naturally free-spirited, had dated over a dozen boyfriends, but simply didn't like Brian. At 21, Brian confessed his feelings to her, and she agreed to be with Brian. At 22, Brian was sent to the hospital after a racing accident and underwent emergency rescue. The next day, the doctor announced that Brian was disabled. That year, the disabled Brian seemed like a different person. With a gloomy and irritable temper, out of her love for him, she refused to move abroad with her parents and chose to stay in the country to take care of him. At 27, Brian recovered from his leg injury, and Grandpa Darren publicly announced that the Darren family would be under his control. The young man was momentarily riding high on success. Span the same year, she unexpectedly fell into a coma at home. When she woke up, the doctor informed her that she had a stomach disease and needed to be hospitalized for surgery. Span, now that I think about it carefully, the sweet romance she thought had fallen from the heavens was filled with lies from the very beginning. More than half a year ago, when she had so much blood drawn at the hospital, Brian said it was for a checkup, But it turned out he was tricking her into donating bone marrow for Ethel. The Bentley slowly drove into the villa area. At midnight, Brian's phone rang. Doris glanced at the caller ID, adorable Ethel. Brian gently swiped to hang up, his slender fingers lightly touching the screen. Soon after, he stood up and hurriedly left. Doris walked over to the window. In the endless dark night, the Bentley gradually drove away. Doris dialed her mother's number. Mom, I've made up my mind. I agree to the marriage alliance with the Colbert family. 7 days from now, as soon as I land at the airport, I'll register the marriage with him. Doris's mom could roughly guess what her daughter had been through. She comforted her for a few moments and patiently analyzed the situation. Are you sure about this, Doris? The Fitzgerald family is not what it used to be. This marriage alliance is no child's play. Colbert family and the Darren family, though separated by thousands of miles, have been sworn enemies for generations, as incompatible as fire and water. Once you form a marriage alliance with the Colbert family, the Colberts might demand that you completely cut off all contact with the Darren family. On the other end of the phone, Doris's watery eyes lowered slightly. 6 years ago, the Fitzgerald family relocated their company abroad due to business expansion and settled overseas from then on. However, shortly after moving abroad, the Fitzgerald family encountered an economic crisis. The Colbert family, also based overseas, repeatedly expressed their desire to form a marriage alliance with the Fitzgerald family, but her parents knew very well that she liked Brian and never thought of sacrificing her marriage to support the company. Now, she no longer wanted to have any contact with Brian in the future, and marrying into the Colbert family was the best choice. Mom, I've made up my mind. I never want to see Brian again in this lifetime. On the other end of the phone, Doris's mom remained silent for a few seconds before saying, All right, tomorrow your father and I will go to the Colbert family's house to discuss the marriage alliance. All night, Doris didn't sleep. The next morning, Brian didn't return, only sending a message. Doris, there's a problem at the company. I'll be away on a business trip for 3 days. Doris didn't respond to him and booked a flight to Contreras 7 days later. She began packing her belongings. Having lived with Brian for the past few years, she had accumulated quite a lot of things. Now that the Fitzgerald family's financial situation was poor, she listed all the items she could sell online. In the evening, a message notification from a stranger popped up on the social media app. Hi Doris. Doris clicked open. The profile picture was the pregnancy test report from when she first found out she was pregnant, and the nickname was Ethel in Bliss. Ethel's account was a newly created private account. She didn't dare to publicize the pregnancy too much, and the only friend she had added was her. A minute later, Ethel shared her newly posted TikTok with her, which featured photos taken when Brian accompanied her for the prenatal checkup, and captioned, He, a gentle, considerate, and extremely wealthy perfect daddy tilde. Doris saw through her little thoughts, gave a like, and commented, Got my bone marrow, recovered from your illness. And now you're provoking me again, Ethel. How does it feel to feast on human blood? And the next day, Doris went to bid farewell to each of her best friends, and along the way, she handed over her luxury items to interested buyers. On her way home, she received Ethel's second TikTok share. It was still a few photos, this time of Brian accompanying her to pick out maternity clothes, pink and white. Every maternity outfit style looked beautiful. Doris scrolled through the previous video. Ethel had replied to her comment in a rather arrogant tone, It's not like I begged you to donate bone marrow to me. It was Brian who was worried about me and forced me to accept it. Doris sneered and replied with a, On the third day, Doris sold all the gifts she had given Brian over the years, those dozen or so shirts, shoes, and watches. Ethel posted another TikTok. This time, Brian booked her an outrageously expensive postpartum care center. She captioned it arrogantly, What can I say? I was just born lucky. In the afternoon, Brian finally came home. He looked at the somewhat empty bedroom and the inexplicably added pink suitcase, his thick brows furrowing tightly. Why is the house so empty? The shirts you gave me are gone. And why did you suddenly buy a suitcase out of the blue? Doris lowered her watery eyes slightly and casually made up an excuse. Those shirts were out of style, so I threw them away. I was thinking about traveling recently, but then I changed my mind. Brian thought she was angry that he hadn't spent time with her for 3 days. So he took out a pre-prepared limited edition Lamborghini supercar purchase contract. I've been busy with work these past few days. I ordered a supercar for you, and I'll go with you to pick it up when it's ready. Doris lowered her gaze to look at the car purchase contract. Unlike other women, she didn't care for handbags. Her only passion was sports cars. This Lamborghini supercar is the one she recently set her sights on. Brian customized it in black and pink, her favorite color combination. Even the seats feature her favorite animated character, Doraemon. Over the past 8 years, Brian has remembered every single one of her preferences clearly. If she hadn't overheard his conversation with Grace at the hospital door, she would have been deeply moved by now. Thank you. Doris set the car purchase contract aside. Brian furrowed his brows, leaned in, and gently pinched her fair cheek, still upset. There's a party tonight, let me take you to unwind. Doris was about to refuse when Brian took her hand and led her down to the first floor. The Bentley had just started moving when Brian's phone rang. It was a call from Momo's Ethel. Doris couldn't make out what was being said, only faintly hearing the words, Brian, woo-woo, save me quickly. Brian's handsome face tightened. He tapped the screen, pulled up Ethel's real-time location from some app, and swiftly turned the car around. We're not going to the gathering first. Ethel has been kidnapped. I need to rush and save her. Brian drove extremely fast, running through over a dozen red lights. 20 minutes later, Brian confirmed that Ethel was in the black car ahead. Squinting, he slammed on the accelerator. Crash! The rear of the black car instantly crumpled. At the same time, the Bentley's passenger seat, where the kidnapped Ethel was violently struck by another accomplice. Doris couldn't dodge in time, and her head was instantly struck and bleeding. The bright red blood slid from the top of her head down to her pale cheeks. The heavy, throbbing pain in her head felt like tens of thousands of tiny needles piercing her heart, leaving her unable to speak for a long time. Despite such a severe collision in the passenger seat, Brian didn't even glance at Doris. His eyes were fixed on Ethel in the black car. After being rammed 3 times in a row, the black car was forced to stop, and the people inside quickly fled into their accomplice's vehicle. Brian pushed open the car door, scooped up Ethel from the back seat, his dark eyes showing tension for the first time. Were you terrified? Are you hurt anywhere? Ethel buried herself in Brian's embrace, tilting her head to reveal a reddened cheek, weeping like a rain-soaked pear blossom. It was my father's business rivals. They just slapped me once. It's nothing serious. The way she looked made Brian's heart ache, and he roared, What do you mean it's nothing? All these years, even when you were abroad, I've always spoiled and pampered you. When have you ever experienced something like this? And the baby, what if something happens to the baby? War. It's all your fault for coming so late. I was so scared. Don't be afraid, it's my fault. I'm taking you for a full body checkup now. Brian carried Ethel and placed her in the back seat of the Bentley. It took him only 5 minutes to drive to the hospital. After getting out of the car, he carried Ethel and rushed toward the emergency room. He didn't notice at all that Doris in the passenger seat had red eyes, and the amount of blood on her head was terrifying. Doris watched the two of them walk away. She lifted her head to hold back her tears, endured the pain, pushed the car door open, and staggered toward the hospital entrance. In the evening, the heavy rain fell. Doris did not use her hands to shield herself from the rain, letting the raindrops soak her wounds. The nurse at the triage desk gasped when she saw Doris, urgently treated her wounds, and then took her for further examination. An hour later, Doris, weak and exhausted, finished the examination and finally had a moment to pick up her phone. The screen showed over a dozen missed calls. It's all Brian's. She didn't hesitate and turned it off directly, thinking about having to get in for until late at night. Doris simply asked the nurse to open a hospital room. In a daze, she recalled the past. Since Brian became disabled, she had been attending work-related drinking gatherings in his place. During one such dinner, 2 company presidents had a disagreement and overturned the table in anger. Plates crashed to the floor instantly, and shattered ceramic fragments ricocheted onto her wrist. Brian rushed over immediately after learning what happened, ordered his assistant to cut off business dealings with both companies on the spot, and urgently took her to the hospital to clean the wound. She felt this was making too big a deal out of it, but Brian gently reassured her, Doris, you are the most important woman in my heart. Other than pregnancy and childbirth, I don't want to see any wounds on your body. A girl should have fair and tender skin all over her body, so that she looks good in clothes and jewelry. Now she was bleeding profusely from her face. Yet he turned a blind eye to her for the sake of another woman. He promised not to let her have any wounds on her body, yet he could let her risk donating bone marrow to someone else. Even getting married and having children, he secretly did it with someone else behind her back. Before falling asleep, Doris saw that Ethel in Happiness had shared a new TikTok. It was a video of Brian kneeling down to wash her feet, willingly doing so to help her fall asleep. Doris watched it over and over, only feeling a tightness in her chest, unable to sleep the entire night. The next morning, Doris unwillingly returned home. As soon as she entered the villa, the butler Jerry looked upset. "Madam, the master is waiting for you by the pool. He's in a bad mood." Doris walked toward the pool and from a distance saw Brian comforting Ethel. Ethel sobbed quietly, her crying utterly heart-wrenching. Brian saw that Doris had finally returned, and the anger on his face could no longer be contained. A chilling aura radiated from him as he said, "Did you deliberately reveal Ethel's whereabouts to her father's enemies?" Doris paused mid-step. She looked at Ethel on the sofa. The girl tilting her head and glancing at her sideways, a smug smile curling her red lips. Doris understood instantly, rubbing her temples in irritation. "I don't even know who her father's enemies are, so how could I have leaked her whereabouts?" Brian looked grim as he pulled out a stack of photos and threw them in front of Doris. "Then how do you explain these photos of you in contact with Ethel's dad's enemies?" Doris glanced down at the photos on the table, her face slightly cold. These were photos taken a few days ago when she was selling second-hand luxury goods and met with a buyer at a cafe for the transaction. No wonder the man had been so straightforward and didn't haggle with her, only insisting on meeting at a cafe. Seeing Doris remain silent, Brian thought she was tacitly agreeing, his handsome face darkening frighteningly. "Have I ever told you that no matter what rumors are spread about me and Ethel, we are completely innocent and have no relationship whatsoever? I've always only treated Ethel as a younger sister. She's truly a kind person, and you've been with me for 8 years. You should know very well how I've treated you during these 8 years. Besides, I proposed to you just a few days ago. How can you justify hurting and making things difficult for her like this?" Doris listened to his words, her heart aching as if pierced by needles. In the 8 years she and Brian had been together, 1 year he had pursued her just to get back at Ethel. And for 5 years he was disabled, with her taking care of him. During those 5 years of his disability, he had been gloomy, broken, and wept bitterly in the dead of night. All of this happened because he had gone life-threatening street racing back then, just to satisfy Ethel's vanity. Yet all the pain caused by Ethel, he had completely forgotten. During those 5 years, in order to help him recover better, she secretly enrolled in rehabilitation studies, massaging and kneading his legs for him every single day without missing one. He was often gloomy back then, so she consulted the best psychologist in Los Angeles, learning how to soothe the emotions of disabled patients. All these efforts she had made, he hadn't remembered a single one. How ironic, actually. Doris really wanted to ask, if he only saw Ethel as a sister, why was he now accompanying her for IVF? "Yes. It's only in the past few days that I've finally understood how you've treated me versus how you've treated her over these 8 years. Brian's expression tightened slightly. "What are you making a fuss about?" Doris didn't want to argue with him. She pointed to the bandage wrapped around her head and gave a self-mocking smile. "Yesterday when she was kidnapped, I got injured on the head too, and it took 5 stitches. Am I really that stupid to hurt myself just to harm her?" Even though Doris had pointed out the fact that she was injured, Brian, who now had all his attention focused on Ethel, still didn't trust her. Doris looking at the man's tense jawline, she felt grateful that she would be leaving in 3 days. "Brian, since you're convinced it was me, just say it. How do you want to resolve this? It's not that I don't believe you, but I've known Ethel for 16 years and 7 months, and she has never lied to anyone." After a pause, Brian frowned deeply. Ready to put an end to the matter, "Doris, you made Ethel cry, so you're responsible for comforting her." At this moment, Ethel, who had been quietly sobbing, threw the ring from her hand into the swimming pool and let out a surprised cry. "Brian, the ring you gave me accidentally fell into the pool." As she spoke, Ethel looked at Doris, her red lips curling into a smug smile as she challenged, "All right, no need to coax me. Pick up that ring." And I'll forgive you for everything you've done to hurt me. Winter had just set in, and the water in the swimming pool was bitingly cold. Doris, the wound on her head hadn't yet healed as she looked down at Brian, who was sitting. The man lowered his brows, making it impossible to see his eyes. His slender fingers lightly tapped on the desk. His aloof head remained lowered, not giving her a single glance. At this moment, Doris felt as if something had pierced her heart. The pain dense and overwhelming. She suddenly remembered the half-year after Brian was diagnosed with a disability. Grandpa Darren came to the hospital to see him, and upon learning that his chances of recovery were slim, began selecting other heirs. That night Brian disappeared from the hospital room. When Doris found him, she discovered he was pushing his wheelchair into the turbulent sea, allowing the icy water to rise up to his chest. Doris was so frightened she hurriedly tried to persuade him, but he pushed her away sharply. "Stop pretending to care about me. You're just my girlfriend, not my wife. If you really want to control me, the wind is strong and the waves are high, swim a lap, and I'll listen to you from now on." Doris stared at him in stunned silence. In truth, she really wanted to tell him that she wasn't being insincere. She genuinely wanted to be his wife. So, even though she was a landlubber, she didn't hesitate and turned to plunge into the sea. The waves were high and the wind strong. She was quickly swept into the ocean and lost consciousness. When she opened her eyes again, she met Brian's worried dark eyes. The man's face was grim, his jaw tight. "Why didn't you tell me you can't swim? Are you crazy? How dare you jump into the sea without knowing how to swim?" She looked up at him, her voice hoarse. "Brian, even if your legs never recover, I still want to marry you. I really like you more than you think." After that, Brian never took her to the beach again, and even prohibited filling the swimming pool at home with water. It was only because she thought it was strange to keep the pool empty that Brian compromised and allowed the servants to fill and change the water daily. Thinking this, Doris twitched the corner of her lips, her small face expressionless. "Want me to pick up the ring? Fine, I'll go get it." As she spoke, Doris didn't even take off her coat before turning and jumping into the swimming pool. The icy water soaked through her skin, making her shiver all over. Doris slowly fell, overwhelmed by boundless fear, yet she stubbornly clenched her teeth and refused to call for help. Soon, a stream of red blood began to spread through the swimming pool. The butler nearby exclaimed in shock, "Oh my God, Madam's head is bleeding." Brian took off his coat, jumped into the swimming pool, and pulled Doris out, roaring, "Enough! Why are you so stubborn? Couldn't you just turn around and leave?" Doris lifted her head, looked at the diamond ring at the bottom of the pool, and said coldly, "Didn't you tell me to make her happy? Now that I'm like this, your white moonlight should be quite satisfied, right?" Brian frowned, his handsome face now terrifyingly dark. "How many times have I told you? I really only see Ethel as a sister. Horace's family in Los Angeles isn't bad either. What if outsiders find out about the things you've done? Public opinion isn't so easy to control these days. I asked you to coax her, to calm her down. Haven't I done all this for your own good?" Brian spoke with deep affection, as if everything was for her benefit. But Doris listened and couldn't help but laugh in sheer anger. He said public opinion is hard to suppress. Back in the day, the dignified Darren family heir became disabled because Ethel went racing. Wasn't that incident forcefully suppressed too? Ethel acts recklessly and tyrannically, bullying the weak and fearing the strong in school, and the Horace family has a poor reputation. Yet haven't they been living smoothly all these years by relying on Brian as their powerful backer? Even the matter of them undergoing IVF, wasn't it also kept tightly under wraps by him? Now, even if the kidnapping was truly my doing, it's now being said to me that public opinion is hard to suppress. In the end, it's still that in Brian's heart, I am far less important than Ethel. Doris didn't want to say another word to Brian. She took off her soaked black coat and walked towards the living room. After only a few steps, perhaps due to excessive blood loss from her head, she suddenly fainted. Brian changed his expression drastically and quickly strode towards Doris. Just as he was about to hold Doris, Ethel suddenly bent down and crouched on the ground, crying with pear blossoms and rain-like tears. "Brian, my lower abdomen hurts so much. Help me upstairs to lie down for a while." Brian paused his steps, withdrew his hand that was about to pick up Doris, turned around and scooped up Ethel in his arms. He let Doris's head hit the ground heavily, then looked at the butler nearby and left only one sentence, Take the lady to the hospital. Doris. When Doris woke again, she met a pair of concerned dark eyes. Brian, seeing her wake up, he hurried to call the doctor, and only after confirming she was all right did he finally breathe a sigh of relief. Doris sharply noticed that there was an extra Buddhist bracelet on her left hand. It seems to be Brian, the one he often wears on his hand. The assistant chuckled beside him and said, "Madam, you haven't woken up, mister. Brian was so worried that he gave you the Buddhist prayer beads he's worn for over a decade, last night. He even vowed before the Buddha that if you woke up safely, he would only eat vegetarian food for the rest of his life and never touch alcohol or cigarettes again." Doris frowned, somewhat disdainfully took off the Buddhist bracelet from her wrist, and handed it to Brian. "No need to change your habits for me." Brian did not take it. He put the Buddhist bracelet back on her wrist and said gently, "Doris, didn't you make a similar vow back when I was disabled?" Doris felt a slight tremor in her heart. In the second year of Brian's disability, she heard that the Lingxian Temple in Los Angeles was very efficacious, so she took Brian there overnight to make a wish. That day, before the Buddha, she made a wish. "I am willing to give everything I have in exchange for Brian's good health," and Brian also made a wish before the Buddha, vowing to marry her in 5 years. At that moment, she looked at the handwritten wish note from Brian and her eyes welled up with tears, while Brian held her close and comforted her for a long time. Those were the rare days when Brian's eyes held only her. Ultimately, it was only when Ethel was absent that Brian had eyes for her. Now that Ethel has returned home, Brian's gaze will no longer linger on her. Doris looked at Brian's handsome face, eager for praise, and lowered her watery eyes. "I'm feeling a bit sleepy." When I woke up again, it was already afternoon. Doris got up and wanted to ask the doctor when she could be discharged from the hospital. Before she could push the door open, she heard the voices of Brian and Grace talking in the hallway. "When do you plan to have the wedding with Doris?" Grace's puzzled voice rang out. Brian slightly lowered his gaze and said calmly, "I mentioned it to her last time. I plan to hold the wedding at the end of the month." Grace nodded and instructed, "This wedding must be a grand affair. Set the bride price, and it can only be more, not less. Doris has already donated bone marrow to your childhood sweetheart. We must not shortchange her on the bride price." As if struck by a thought, Grace suddenly changed the subject. "What a coincidence, you're getting married this month, and I heard the Colbert family, our rivals, are also having a wedding soon. The bride is also named Doris." Hearing this, Doris hurriedly pushed the door open. She cleared her throat softly, and the two immediately stopped talking. That evening, the doctor announced that she could be discharged from the hospital. After returning home, Doris received a friend request, and the other person sent 3 words, "Louis." Doris blinked, thinking it might be the one she married, and she clicked to accept the request. As soon as it was accepted, the other person sent over a betrothal gift list. A notebook was filled with densely written betrothal gift details. Doris glanced over it briefly, feeling there were too many to count. Then, Louis sent 2 more messages. "This is the betrothal gift list. Let me know if you're satisfied with it. Aunt Lynn told me your flight is the day after tomorrow, and you'll arrive at the airport early the following morning. Aunt Lynn and I will pick you up then." Doris pondered for a few seconds before replying, "The bride price is enough, thank you." The other party did not reply again. All night, Brian kept trying to find topics to talk about with Doris, but Doris remained unenthusiastic. Brian thought she was still upset about what had happened before. To cheer her up, he had his assistant arrange a pre-wedding bachelor party for the next day. The next day, everyone in their circle knew it was Brian's pre-wedding bachelor party, and many people showed up that night. Doris had just arrived at the banquet venue when Brian wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled out 2 car purchase contracts. He first handed one of the car purchase contracts to Doris, his dark eyes profound as he said, "I always felt that the supercar from last time wasn't worthy of you, so I ordered a new one for you these past couple of days." After a pause, he handed the original Lamborghini purchase contract to Ethel, who was dressed pitifully, and said gently, "Ethel, this car was originally meant for your sister-in-law, but now that she has a new one, we're giving it to you. I just hope you don't feel shortchanged." Ethel took the car purchase contract with barely contained delight, her smile almost breaking through. "It's fine. Today's sister-in-law gets first pick." That's what she said. But anyone could see that the Lamborghini supercar Brian gave to Ethel was a limited edition model available nationwide. The newly purchased supercar for Doris is just an ordinary, slightly expensive sports car. The guests nearby couldn't help but whisper among themselves, "Is the bride Brian is about to marry really Doris? This is clearly Doris and his pre-wedding bachelor party. So why is he giving a gift to Ethel?" With all these excuses, isn't it just an attempt to give that limited edition supercar to Ethel, who doesn't know Doris loves her car like her own life? Ethel's move is just meant to disgust her, isn't it? Sure, I heard Ethel is amazing at racing. I have inside information, she's the famous racer June. Brian initially fell for her because June saved his life on the racetrack. Doris sat in the corner, quietly listening to everyone's discussion, her brow slightly furrowed. June, isn't that me? Doris didn't have time to think it through when many people around, after analyzing the situation, approached Ethel with their wine glasses, showering her with flattery. "Ethel, Brian is so good to you, gifting you such an expensive supercar without a second thought. Your white dress is so beautiful, it makes you look like a real princess. I heard you're amazing at racing, truly versatile and sweet, a perfect match for Brian." More and more people went to flatter Ethel, forgetting that the star of the day was Doris. It wasn't until an hour later that the atmosphere started to liven up, with everyone singing and playing games. Brian always sat close to Ethel, his gaze constantly following Ethel. Ethel was craving crab. Brian patiently lowered his voice and coaxed her, "Be good, you can't eat that while you're pregnant. I'll buy it for you after you give birth." Ethel teared up and wanted to throw a tantrum. Brian sighed and handed her an unlimited black card from his wallet. This unlimited black card soon caused quite a stir. Could it be that Brian still can't get over Ethel? Sigh. They say the current partner can never compare to the first love. Turns out it's all true. Amid the chatter, Doris sat quietly in the corner. She lowered her head, playing with her phone, as if the surrounding commotion had nothing to do with her. Ethel looked around, her gaze falling on Doris in the corner. She walked over in her high heels, her face full of smugness. "Today is your and Brian's pre-wedding bachelor party, but I stole the spotlight. Everyone is fawning over me and trying to please me. You must be really upset, right? But no matter how upset you are, you can only grit your teeth and bear it. After all, what does it matter that you accompanied Brian through his toughest 5 years, as long as I appear before Brian? Brian's favorite person will still be me." Doris knew that Ethel wanted to make her angry, but she had already shed all her tears on the day she was discharged from the hospital. Ethel, seeing her ignore her, a chill rose in her watery eyes. Her gaze fell on Doris's jade bracelet on her wrist, a flash of jealousy in her eyes, and she suddenly snatched it into her hand. "You're crazy, what do you want to do?" Doris raised her hand to snatch it back, but Ethel secretly exerted more force. She caressed the jade bracelet, a flash of jealousy and resentment in her eyes. "I heard that this was given to you by Mrs. Darren as a gift for being the future daughter-in-law." Doris gazed at her, about to speak, when she saw Ethel suddenly shove the bracelet into her mouth, forcibly tearing the corner of her lips and drawing a trail of blood. Bright red blood dripped from the corner of her mouth as Ethel delicately collapsed to the ground, the jade bracelet falling to the floor. She looked up and cried, "Sister-in-law, I just thought Mrs. Darren's bracelet was pretty. Why did you suddenly shove the bracelet into my mouth? It hurts so much, woo-woo." Doris hadn't even processed what was happening when a black figure flashed by, and she was shoved hard away. Doris lost her balance, stumbling violently and crashing into the table nearby that held the giant celebration cake. The wound on her head split open again, oozing blood. The cake slipped and fell on Doris. Sticky and messy, Doris, her eyes red with pain, looked up at Brian as he rushed over, without even a glance in her direction. He worriedly picked up a handkerchief and wiped the blood from the corner of Ethel's mouth, his dark eyes filled with deep distress. Doris finally understood what kind of act Ethel was putting on. She wiped the sticky cream off her face, picked up the jade bracelet from the floor, and handed it to Ethel. Just as Brian thought she was trying to provoke Ethel and was about to get angry, Doris grabbed Ethel's wrist and put the jade bracelet on her hand. "Mrs. Darren gave this to me. You really like it, right? Then I'll give it to you." Ethel looked up in confusion, forgetting even to act pitiful. Brian frowned, unable to understand what Doris was trying to do. "This was my mother's birthday gift to you. Only Darren family's daughter-in-law can wear it. Doris stood up and said coldly, "It's been touched by her. It's dirty now. I don't want it anymore." After saying this, she turned around and limped away without caring what expressions the two behind her wore. Behind her, Brian watched Doris's indifferent back, his handsome face slightly cold. Late at night, Brian finally returned. After washing up, he slipped into bed, looked at Doris who had her back to him, and sighed. "Don't be angry, and don't always target Ethel. She respects and likes you very much as her sister-in-law. Ethel said she wants to take the initiative to build a good relationship with you. She'll be staying with us for the next few days, so please don't bully her anymore." Recently, Doris closed her eyes and didn't respond to him, only saying calmly, if Ethel wasn't June, would you still be so good to her?" Brian gently stroked Doris's head, his voice hoarse. "She's my sister. I'm good to her because she's Ethel, and it has nothing to do with whether she's June or not." Doris lowered her gaze and responded faintly, "Anyway, there was only one day left. She just needed to stay here for one more day." Early the next morning, Doris had just woken up when she heard sweet laughter coming from the second floor. She got up and walked outside, and from a distance, she could see Brian teaching Ethel flower arranging in the second floor hall. The two were very close. Brian gently explained to Ethel how to trim different flowers. Watching the heartwarming scene between the two, Doris felt a little dazed. Brian when he was disabled. She worried he might get bored, so for a while she took the initiative to teach him flower arranging. The man had an excellent memory. He learned it after just one demonstration from her. Later, he had his assistant order flowers, and the first thing he did every morning was arrange a bouquet and place it by her bedside. But ever since Ethel returned to the country, he seemed to have stopped doing so. Doris slightly lowered her eyelashes, concealing the loneliness in her eyes. She paced downstairs, ready to have breakfast, but she had only taken a few steps when she was knocked to the ground by a heavy vase. Bang! Her skull was instantly shattered, and a stream of blood flowed down from her head, the pain so intense that she curled up on the ground. In her dazed state, she saw Ethel slowly descending from the second floor, beaming with a smile. "Oh dear, sister-in-law, I just wanted to show you the flowers I just arranged, but my hand slipped and accidentally hit your head. What should we do? You're covered in blood. It looks so scary. Should I call an ambulance for you? But I'm so frightened I can't even pick up my phone. You won't blame me, will you, sister-in-law? Just endure it a little longer." Doris fainted from the pain before she could even finish listening. Later, it was the maid who saw her and, after being startled, hurriedly sent Doris to the hospital. By the time she woke up again, it was already noon. Doris's head had been stitched up with a total of 30 stitches, and it looked absolutely horrifying. The doctor said she had a mild concussion, accompanied by temporary blindness in her right eye. Brian stood by the hospital bed, leaning over to ask if she was in pain, his heart aching as he helped her sit up to drink some water. His actions showed care for her, but the words that escaped his lips leaned in favor of Ethel. "Ethel knows she was wrong. And she feels guilty too. She was so remorseful she almost fainted just now. When the servant brought you to the hospital, a paparazzo took a photo. Now everyone is waiting for you to clarify the situation publicly. Doris, when the time comes, just tell everyone that you accidentally fell and hit your head. That way, the Horace family will owe you a favor. You know, Ethel is June, and she saved my life before." Doris turned over, pulling the covers over her head. Whether it was physical pain or heartache, Doris, curled up under the covers, felt her eyes well up with tears. She remembered when she was in poor health, a time when she often had a low-grade fever. Brian hired 3 private doctors to take turns staying by her side around the clock. When she had period cramps, Brian would comfort her all day, letting her eat and drink only while staying in bed. But now, the person before her was no longer the same as before. Brian noticed Doris on the hospital bed quietly sobbing. His heart ached, and just as he was about to go comfort her, a nurse hurriedly entered the room. "Mr. Brian, the girl who came with you this morning suddenly fainted from crying. Would you like to go check on her?" Hearing that Ethel had fainted from crying, Brian didn't bother with Doris and turned to walk out into the corridor. Soon, the ward fell quiet again, leaving only Doris alone. 10 minutes later, Doris's phone vibrated with a text message from Ethel. "So what if you had 30 stitches in your head and lost your right eye? I don't even have to cry. and he comes running to me right away. Doris, I disappeared for a few years, and when I came back and said I wanted to have his child, he agreed. How could he not love me? Not long after, Doris received another video from Ethel. Brian was comforting the softly crying Ethel, his eyes red with heartache. Darling, don't blame yourself. I told you I would always protect you. Doris only suffered a head injury, it's not a big deal. She won't tell anyone that you were the one who hit her. You're pregnant now and need to focus on taking good care of yourself. Don't worry about these trivial matters. Doris finished watching the video, her fingers digging deeply into her palms. She forced herself to get up and left the hospital alone, with 6 hours left before departure. Doris went to Lingshen Temple and cut down the wish strip she had written herself, which said I want to marry Brian and be his wife. As the cold wind swept through the temple, Brian's 2 wish strips from years ago blew into Doris's hands. Doris picked them up and glanced at them. The first wish strip read, "Marry Doris as my bride in 5 years. Second wish, as long as you come back, I will always choose you, no matter when." Doris looked at the wish note and sneered a few times. Congratulations, Brian, you got your wish. Soon, Doris returned to the villa. The phone kept vibrating incessantly, with provocative messages from Ethel. Doris only glanced at it. Sitting at her desk, she slowly wrote a farewell letter and included a photo of June. Then, she picked up her suitcase and went downstairs. Doris placed the engagement ring Brian had given her during his hospital proposal into a grey velvet jewelry box and handed it to the butler. "When Brian comes back, please give this to him and let him know there's a letter left for him on the desk." The butler saw Doris just taking off her engagement ring. He vaguely guessed what was happening and said in shock, "Madam, thank you Jerry for taking care of me these past few years. If fate allows, we'll meet again someday." Doris waved her hand, pulled her suitcase, and took a taxi to the airport. An hour later, at the airport entrance, her best friend Lilith reluctantly bid farewell to Doris. "Doris, once you leave, don't come back. Take care of yourself abroad, and never bother with that scumbag Brian again in this lifetime." Doris embraced Lilith with reddened eyes, gazing at the city of Los Angeles as she slightly lifted her chin. Los Angeles, goodbye forever, Brian. The entire next day, Brian stayed in Ethel's hospital room, coaxing her through checkups, coaxing her to take medicine. Even though Doris's hospital room was just 1 floor below, he didn't go to see Doris even once. In the evening, Ethel insisted on being discharged from the hospital. Brian took Ethel back to the villa and patiently coaxed her to sleep. The butler, seeing him finally come downstairs, handed over a grey gift box and stammered, "Madam came back yesterday and asked me to give this to you." Brian took the grey gift box with an unpleasant expression. "She's been discharged from the hospital. Didn't I tell her to stay there and recuperate? What's she doing coming home? Don't tell me she's making a scene again. Didn't I explain to her? There's nothing between Ethel and me. I only see her as a little sister." The grey gift box was opened, and the engagement ring suddenly appeared before Brian, causing him to freeze for a moment. The butler quietly reminded him, "The madam also said she left a letter for you in the study on the 2nd floor." Brian tugged at his tie, feeling inexplicably restless, and strode upstairs toward the study. There was indeed a letter on the desk. When the words farewell letter came into Brian's sight, he had a bad premonition. Brian read every word without missing a single one, and his mind exploded with a bang, an unprecedented panic surging inside him. This is bad. That day, when Grace spoke with him at the hospital, everything was overheard by Doris. The carefully woven lie was exposed. Brian panicked and wanted to call Doris, when his eyes suddenly caught a photo on the table. At that moment, the girl was wearing a red racing suit, casually sitting in the race car. She took off her mask, made a peace sign with her right hand, and smiled freely at the camera. Wait, June, this face. So, Doris was the one who saved his life on the field. The June he had always wanted to repay. Impossible. Brian, trembling, dialed Doris's phone number. A cold voice quickly came from the receiver. "The number you have dialed has been deactivated." Brian refused to give up and sent a message to Doris. Doris's account also showed as deactivated. He tried every possible way to contact Doris, but all efforts ended in vain. Brian had no choice but to call Doris's best friend Lilith. After being hung up on 3 times in a row, the call finally went through. On the other end of the phone, Lilith was sitting in the living room watching TV. Disturbed multiple times, her tone was very displeased. "Mr. Brian, what can I do for you?" Brian ignored her sarcastic tone and asked directly, "Doris, is it June?" "Ha," Lilith sneered mockingly. "Brian, don't tell me you're only finding out now that Doris is June." Brian frowned. "She never told me about these things." Lilith nearly laughed in exasperation. "Over these past few years, all your attention has been on Ethel. When have you ever truly cared about Doris?" Brian stared at the disconnected call, his dark eyes filled with panic. 12 years ago, Ethel confessed to him on her own initiative, claiming that she was the June he was looking for. When Ethel described the details of how she saved him on the racetrack that day, coupled with the fact that they had known each other since childhood, he naturally believed her. However, from the time he met Doris, although he knew Doris was passionate about sports cars, he never really noticed that Doris was into racing. Come to think of it, it was the day the doctors declared his legs fully healed. After 5 years of being disabled, he slowly stood up and embraced Doris, saying with deep emotion, "Doris, thank you for saving my life. If it weren't for Doris taking care of him all along, he might not have lived to see this day." At that time, Doris gave him a sly smile. "This makes 2 lives I've saved for you now." He had wanted to ask for more details at the time, but Ethel's phone call came through, interrupting his train of thought. Brian was so enraged at the thought of being deceived for a full 12 years that he nearly burst a blood vessel. He strode purposefully into the adjacent bedroom and shook the sleeping Ethel awake. In Ethel's hazy eyes, Brian threw the photo of June onto Ethel's face, his large hand gripping her delicate neck. "Ethel, how dare you deceive me?" Ethel, who had been drowsy just a moment ago, looked at the furious Brian before her and vaguely guessed what was happening. She hurriedly picked up the photos scattered on the bed. At this sight, after the initial panic, her watery eyes filled with intense jealousy, and she even forgot to hide it. "Impossible. Doris, that trashy woman, can't possibly be the legendary June." Back then, June was only 16 years old, but among the racers in Los Angeles, she was already a top-tier legendary figure. Brian leaned close to Ethel, his dark eyes burning with intense fire. "I've confirmed it. Doris is June. And June is Doris." "Ethel, you deceived me so cruelly." Back then at the racetrack, June competed in the same group as him. That day, his race car was sabotaged by an enemy and caught fire. June, who was about to cross the finish line in first place, gave up the $1 million prize, turned around, and risked danger to save him. After rescuing him, June arrogantly lifted his chin and said, "Hey, I saved you, so don't forget to repay the favor." He remembered this debt of gratitude for a full 12 years, but who would have thought that he had repaid the wrong person? Thinking of this, Brian pushed away the sobbing Ethel with a cold expression and issued a cold order to leave. "Ethel, you move back to Horace's house right now." Brian ignored Ethel's pleas and had the butler escort her out. Immediately after, with a darkened expression, he dialed his assistant's number, his tone icy cold. "Look into Ethel's kidnapping incident and that day's party, an airport in Country A." As the plane landed, Doris took out a hat and put it on, covering the medical bandage on her head. At the exit, Doris's dad, Doris's mom, had been waiting for a long time. Standing beside the two of them was a strange man dressed in a grey suit, with an exquisitely handsome appearance. It had been a long time since she had seen her daughter, Doris's mom, and her kind face was filled with unconcealable joy. "Come here, Doris. Let me introduce you. This is Louis." Doris carefully examined her fiancé. The warm light spilled over him, outlining his sharp and refined features. The man's thin lips were pressed tightly together, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth, yet it inexplicably gave off a sense of aloofness. "Hello, I am Doris." Doris spoke softly. Louis narrowed his dark eyes slightly, looking her over. His sharp gaze lingered on the hat she was wearing before he finally spoke after a long moment. "Louis, your fiancé." An hour later, the black car slowly pulled up at the entrance of the Civil Affairs Bureau. Louis's dad, Louis's mom, had been waiting at the entrance of the Civil Affairs Bureau for quite some time. Louis's mom couldn't hide the smile on her face when she saw Doris. The daughter-in-law her son had chosen was tall and slender. With fair and dewy skin, she was many times more beautiful in person than in photos, clearly someone who had been well cared for since childhood. Louis's mom grew more and more pleased the longer she looked. So, she generously took off the jade bracelet from her wrist. Doris, this was given to me by Louis's grandmother when I married his father. Now, I pass it on to you. Doris could tell the quality of the jade bracelet at a glance and felt somewhat overwhelmed by the favor. Just as she was about to refuse, Louis parted his thin lips and said softly, "Mom is giving you a token of her heart. Please accept it." Doris then felt reassured and accepted it. Louis's dad spoke up from the side, "I had my secretary transfer a portion of the Colbert family's shares to your name, Doris." Louis's dad said this in a very calm tone, so calm that it sounded as if he were saying he transferred $10,000 to you. But Doris knew full well the value of the Colbert family's shares. Nowadays, the Colbert family is developing rapidly and is a leader in the business world. These shares are far more valuable than the jade bracelet. "Thank you, uncle and aunt." Doris had slightly reddened eyes and was somewhat moved. Receiving two generous gifts upon their first meeting was enough to show how much the Colbert family valued her. Back in the day, Brian's mom had also given her a jade bracelet. But she knew very well that it was something she had earned by taking care of the disabled Brian for a full 5 years. In recent years, the Fitzgerald family had been on a gradual decline, and Brian's mom always felt she fell a bit short. They had privately expressed the hope that Brian would marry the eldest daughter of another family to secure his position. "Let's go, we're going in to get our marriage certificate," Louis reminded her. "Okay." Doris followed Louis into the Civil Affairs Bureau to get their marriage certificate. More than 10 minutes later, the matter was settled. Doris looked down at the marriage certificate in her hand, lost in thought for a few seconds. Louis said from the side, "I bought a villa in the city as our marital home. I just sent you the address and the door code. The property deed for the villa is only under your name. Since you just got back, you should stay at your parents' place for the next 3 days. As for the wedding, it will be held in 2 weeks. We can discuss how to arrange it then." At the same time, Los Angeles, Darren's group office, the assistant placed an invitation in front of Brian. "Mr. Brian, the matter regarding Ms. Ethel is still under investigation. This is a wedding invitation just sent by the Colbert family." "Colbert," Brian frowned. The Colbert family rarely sent them invitations. He picked up the invitation and opened it for a look. "Groom, Louis. Bride, Doris." Brian looked at the bride's name, his heart fluttering with unease. At that moment, Doris opened her phone. Louis had indeed sent the villa's address and door code. The man was even more considerate than she had imagined. He even considered having her stay at her parents' house first. Doris looked at the handsome man before her. For the first time, she felt that this impulsive marriage might not be such a bad choice. The two families had lunch together, and the atmosphere was exceptionally harmonious. They didn't part ways until the afternoon. In the evening, Doris's dad prepared a full table of dishes together. After a long time, the family of 3 was reunited once again. Doris's dad was very happy tonight, drank quite a bit of alcohol, and became more talkative. "Speaking of which, we have quite a connection with the Colbert family. At first, we weren't very familiar with the Colbert family, but over the years, the Colbert family has helped us a lot, both openly and behind the scenes. If it weren't for the Colbert family's assistance, our Fitzgerald family would have collapsed long ago." Doris was somewhat surprised. The Colbert family has been helping them these past few years. 3 days passed quickly. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Louis came to pick up Doris. Doris reluctantly bid farewell to her parents. Doris's mom looked at Louis not far away. She held Doris's hand and whispered, "I can tell that Louis really likes you. You should spend more time with him and give it a try." Doris lowered her gaze, looking at Louis standing by the car, and slightly frowned. Why did she feel like he didn't really like her that much? The car was quiet the whole way, neither of them speaking. It wasn't until the car stopped in front of the hospital that Doris tilted her head and asked in confusion, "Are you sick?" Louis gazed at the large hat she was wearing. "You're injured. Let's get you checked at the hospital first. Then we'll go home." Doris froze for a moment, feeling a warmth in her heart, yet also a bit curious. "How did you know I have a head injury?" She had kept it well hidden for the past 3 days. Even her parents hadn't noticed the injury on her head. Louis turned his head, his slender fingers lightly tapping on the steering wheel, his dark eyes resting on the woman's fair face. "Just a guess." That day when he went to pick her up at the airport, Doris was dressed exquisitely, from head to toe. She was coordinated in comfortable color tones, clearly a woman who loved beauty. Only this hat was too big, covering her entire head, yet it clearly didn't match the rest of her outfit. When getting into the car later, Doris's head lightly bumped against the door. Logically, a light bump shouldn't hurt much. But he noticed Doris sucking in a sharp breath as if in extreme pain. Doris widened her watery eyes, looking somewhat incredulous. "Lewis, you're such a detail-oriented person." Private hospital, top floor, DR. Marsh had been waiting for a long time. He looked curiously at Doris following behind Lewis and couldn't help but comment, "You made me wait for you at the hospital since early morning, and you're only showing up now. Wait, is this the one you've been dreaming about day and?" Lewis frowned and cut him off. "My wife, Doris, DR. Marsh immediately understood and shut his mouth. He gave Doris a full body checkup. Under Lewis's urging, DR. Marsh changed the dressing on Doris's head with the gentlest possible touch. An hour later, the test results finally came out. DR. Marsh analyzed them for a long time, then called Lewis out into the corridor, his expression grave. "Lewis, your wife Doris not only has a head injury, but she's also experiencing temporary blindness in her eyes. Fortunately, the vision in her right eye is gradually returning, but from my observation, Doris's head wound doesn't look like it was caused by a single collision. It more closely resembles injuries formed by multiple deliberate impacts. I asked a friend to check with hospitals in Los Angeles and obtained her recent medical records. Some abnormalities were discovered. If Doris was hospitalized due to a stomach infection, these medications shouldn't have been used in the early stages. Based on my years of medical experience, I suspect your wife unknowingly donated bone marrow." A surge of anger rose from his chest. Lewis picked up his phone and commanded in a low voice, "Check what Doris has experienced recently in Los Angeles." Early the next morning, Lewis received a call from his assistant. "Mr. Lewis, everything about Madam's experiences in Los Angeles has been compiled into a document and sent to you." In the study, Lewis looked at the document, his handsome face turning cold. The Colbert family and the Darren family have been enemies for generations. He never involved himself in the grudges and hatreds of the elders, being of the younger generation himself, but now that they've harmed his wife Doris, that's a different matter entirely. The Darren family wants that shipment at the docks recently. Outbid them, no matter the cost. On the other end of the phone, the assistant fell silent for a few seconds before asking, "Mr. Lewis, are you suggesting we go to war directly with the Darren family?" At this moment, in Los Angeles, Ethel was forced to move back to the Horace residence. She sent multiple messages to Brian, pleading pitifully for his forgiveness, but Brian never replied to her once. Ethel refused to give up. She went to the bar Brian frequented and, dressed provocatively, threw herself into his arms. "Brian, I missed you." Brian looked down, recognizing Ethel's face. He pulled her away from him with utter disgust. "Get the hell out of here." Brian pushed with great force. Ethel lost her balance and fell heavily to the ground, surrounded by people from the same social circle. Some girls she had previously looked down on covered their mouths and snickered. Ethel had never suffered such humiliation before. She got up, stamped her foot in frustration, and stormed off. The next morning, Brian was reviewing the information his assistant had investigated. His handsome face was unusually dark, his eyes wide with fury. Ethel was not only not June, but this woman also had a malicious heart. After receiving Doris's bone marrow, not only did she fail to be grateful, but she repeatedly harmed and framed Doris. He couldn't imagine how Doris had managed to get through this period. If it were him, he would have probably gone mad long ago. Brian had a fierce glare in his eyes, and the murderous aura emanating from him was particularly dangerous. After what felt like an eternity, he finally calmed down and slowly picked up the phone on the table. He opened Ethel's chat page, tapped the screen with a dark expression. "I'm at the villa, come over now," Ethel replied almost instantly, her tone revealing happiness. "Brian, have you forgiven me? I'll get ready and head over now." Brian stopped looking at his phone and had the housekeeper fill the pool with water, then dump in crate after crate of ice. Half an hour later, Ethel happily walked into the villa. She had clearly put effort into her appearance, wearing an innocent little white dress and makeup that blended purity with allure. She was well aware that this outfit of hers would be an absolute knockout in front of Brian. Ethel was about to approach Brian when Brian, stroking his wine glass, slightly lifted his chin. Two bodyguards nearby stepped over to Ethel. Pressing down on her shoulders from both sides, "Ms. Ethel, Mr. Brian asked us to take you to the poolside." Ethel winced from the pain in her shoulders. When had she ever been treated like this by Brian's men? She coldly snapped, "Let go of me. What do you think you're doing? I'm your future mistress." The two bodyguards remained expressionless. They dragged Ethel to the edge of the pool and mercilessly shoved her head deep into the water. Ethel's meticulously applied makeup was instantly ruined. The icy pool water choked her nose, sending shivers racking through her entire body. After drinking 3 mouthfuls of the pond water, her mind actually cleared up. Brian is still angry with her. "Brian, didn't you call me over because you had already cooled down? I told you last time. Actually, as soon as I returned to the country, I wanted to explain to you that I'm not June, but recently Doris has been bullying me constantly. I was so furious that I forgot to tell you about this matter. You saw it all. Last time I was kidnapped, it was all because of Doris. And at the party that day my lips were split open." "Boo-hoo," Ethel sobbed with a trembling voice, as if she had been wronged to the extreme. Brian placed the wine glass on the table expressionlessly, then paced over to Ethel and slightly raised his hand. The bodyguard immediately understood the signal and pulled Ethel to her feet. Ethel looked up in disarray. Just as she was delightedly thinking Brian had softened, Brian let out a cold laugh, then raised his foot and stepped on Ethel's head, pressing it fiercely into the water. Suddenly, he said gloomily, "At a time like this, you still want to frame Doris, Ethel. I know everything you've done." The man's voice was icy cold, each word pounding on Doris's heart. Doris trembled all over, fear instantly wrapping around her entire body, to the point where she even forgot to struggle. "No. It's impossible. Brian, how could he know about the things she had done? No, even if he knew, so what? She still carried his child in her womb. Brian, at most, he would punish her a little, but he wouldn't do anything too severe to her." Doris, thinking of this, she immediately regained her confidence. As Brian withdrew his foot, Ethel clung to Brian's leg, crying so hard her whole body trembled. "Brian, it's all because I love you so much. It's all because I love you and want to have a beautiful future with you that I did those things. I'm not a bad person by nature." Woo-woo. Brian lifted his foot again, using his toe to raise Ethel's chin, his dark eyes filled with disgust. "You should never, ever have provoked and hurt Doris after receiving the bone marrow she donated. Ethel, you're a woman rotten to the core. Just looking at you a few more times makes me sick." After a pause, Brian nudged Ethel's face with the tip of his shoe, his handsome face full of indifference. "You like making people pick things up, don't you? That ring you threw last time still hasn't been picked up. Go pick it up now." Ethel looked at him in despair, the water from her hair dripping down her face and onto the ground. At this moment, she was utterly disheveled. "But I'm carrying your child, Brian. Such cold water could easily harm the baby. Besides, I've been by your side for over a decade. Do you really feel no sentiment for our past?" "Ha!" Brian nearly laughed in disbelief, his tone dripping with coldness. "Old feelings. If you hadn't pretended to be June back then, do you think I would have given you a second glance? Ethel, you ruined my life. You destroyed the impression I had in Doris's heart. Do you really think I would forgive you so easily? What are you still standing there for? Get to it." The two bodyguards grabbed Ethel and threw her directly into the swimming pool. Ethel knew how to swim, but the pool water was freezing cold. Before long, she was shivering uncontrollably, her whole body trembling. She gritted her teeth and swam to the edge. Just as her hand touched the pool wall, Brian lifted his foot and stomped hard on her fingers. Ethel turned deathly pale from the pain, screaming and begging for mercy, but ultimately couldn't endure the agony and fell back into the swimming pool. Soon, a vivid red color emerged in the clear pool water. Brian narrowed his eyes dangerously, the resentment in his heart finally subsiding slightly. "Doris, did you see that? I have avenged you. Please come back soon." Half an hour later, Ethel was taken to the hospital by her bodyguards. She wanted to resist and struggle, but Brian had already arranged for the doctors to ensure the child was aborted today, no matter what. As the anesthesia entered her body, Ethel quickly lost consciousness. When she woke again, she lay on a cold hospital bed, her belly now empty. Ethel had cried her eyes red. She vented her fury in the hospital room, frantically smashing everything in sight, pillows, cups, shoes. Seeing that she couldn't be stopped, the nurse had no choice but to call Brian. "Mr. Fu, if you don't come soon, the hospital room is going to be torn apart." Ethel had thought that Brian wouldn't come, but to her surprise, Brian soon appeared in the hospital room. He looked at the messy room and the pale-faced Ethel, saying coldly, "I still have 2 scores to settle with you. I originally planned to wait until you recovered before dealing with them slowly. Seems like you're in pretty good physical condition now." The man said this in a very calm tone, but Ethel's eyes filled with a trace of fear. She shrank back on the hospital bed, looking fearfully at the man before her. Completely devoid of the ferocity she had shown in her frenzy just 10 minutes earlier. I haven't fully recovered yet." Brian slowly walked to the bedside, lifted Ethel's chin, and said in a deep voice, "At the last gathering, didn't you intentionally tear the corner of your own mouth and falsely accuse Doris of shoving the jade bracelet into your mouth? Oh, and you also hit her on the head with a vase." Brian finished speaking and lightly clapped his hands. 2 bodyguards lifted a massive box. When opened, it revealed 10 vases and over half a box full of jade bracelets. Ethel guessed her impending situation. Her face turned deathly pale, trembling all over with fear. The next second, she climbed out of the hospital bed, knelt before Brian, and began kowtowing repeatedly. "I was wrong. I was truly wrong. I'll publicly apologize to Doris. I'll even kneel and apologize to her. All right, Brian, please let me go, considering I just had a miscarriage." "Let you go?" Brian looked down at Ethel, his gaze terrifyingly cold. "Ethel, how could a verbal apology ever be enough? You must endure everything Doris went through before you can beg for her forgiveness." Brian finished speaking and looked toward the 2 bodyguards standing nearby. One of the bodyguards swiftly bound Ethel's hands, while the other grabbed a handful of jade bracelets and shoved them directly into Ethel's mouth. Ethel struggled desperately, but the bodyguard kept forcing more into her mouth, until 2 minutes later, Ethel had the corners of her mouth completely torn on both sides. Drip, drip, blood dripped from her chin onto the ground. Ethel was in so much pain that her eyes turned red, and tears streamed down her face. In the past, Ethel would feel even the slightest discomfort. Brian would be heartbroken and deeply concerned. Now Brian sat on the sofa, watching her suffer with indifference. "All right, let's settle the next score. It's time to throw the vase." Worried the height wasn't sufficient, Brian had the bodyguard take Ethel back to the villa. The box of vases was brought to the villa's 2nd floor, leaving only Ethel alone in the main hall on the 1st floor. The bodyguard picked up the vase and threw it down heavily. The vase swiftly landed on Ethel's head. Crash! A heart-wrenching scream echoed throughout the entire villa. Ethel's scalp instantly split open, and a surge of thick blood filled the entire villa. The bodyguard remained expressionless, throwing down vases one after another. Ethel shouted until her voice grew hoarse. Brian didn't even spare her a glance in the end. In the end, 10 vases smashed onto Ethel's head. Ethel completely lost consciousness. Brian slowly looked up, his eyes sinister. "Send her back to Horace's house." Ethel had barely been sent away when Grace rushed to the villa. She looked at Brian, whose face was gloomy on the sofa, and her expression turned grim. "I have some bad news, and you need to be prepared. Doris probably won't be coming back. I heard she's getting married. The Colbert family's eldest son Louis is marrying Doris, who happens to be your ex-girlfriend Doris." Brian's dark eyes turned icy as he angrily exclaimed, "Impossible." Seeing that Brian didn't believe her, Grace took out a photo to show him. This was taken by the paparazzi. In the photo, Louis and Doris are having lunch together. Louis is considerately holding a handkerchief, gently wiping the grease off Doris's face. "Is she over there? I'll book a flight to go find her right now." Grace grabbed him abruptly and reminded, "Lately you've been completely focused on finding Doris. Haven't you been paying attention to business matters?" The Colbert family snatched that batch of goods at the dock at a high price, likely as a warning to you. Brian, have you thought it through? Are you really determined to declare war on the Colbert family for Doris's sake? Brian slightly lowered his head, his handsome face filled with anguish. After a long while, he finally spoke in a hoarse voice. "Sis, without her, I'd go crazy." Grace sighed and didn't try to persuade him any further. Meanwhile, Doris began taking over the Fitzgerald family. In the first few days after taking over, Doris was so busy that she left early and returned late, completely overwhelmed. Fortunately, she was quite clever, and with Lewis's guidance, she quickly got into the swing of things. Doris sorted through the business dealings of the Fitzgerald family over the past few years and soon noticed something suspicious. Several projects that had dragged down the Fitzgerald family were all linked to subsidiaries of the Darren family branch. Doris was analyzing them one by one when Lewis walked into the office carrying a lunchbox. Seeing Doris looking pale, Lewis frowned and asked with concern, "What's wrong? You look so pale." Doris pointed at several contracts on the desk and said bluntly, "I can't understand why Brian's uncles, and some of his relatives, would want to harm our Fitzgerald family." Lewis picked up the contract, browsed through each page, and his expression turned serious. "The Darren family has always been fond of internal conflicts. They probably thought you would marry Brian, so they resorted to this desperate measure to bring down the Fitzgerald family." After a pause, he added, "Logically speaking, the Fitzgerald family hasn't been doing well these past few years, and Brian must have known about it, but he doesn't seem to have paid much attention to the Fitzgerald family." Ethel smiled self-deprecatingly. Brian had focused all his attention on Ethel over the years. Even when Ethel went abroad, he still sent money on time without fail. How could he possibly have the mind to bother with the affairs of the Fitzgerald family? But this also proves that my parents' decision was not wrong. All afternoon, Lewis accompanied Doris in analyzing the investment data of the Fitzgerald family over the past few years. Only after thoroughly sorting everything out did Doris finally breathe a sigh of relief. "Shall we go take our wedding photos tomorrow afternoon?" Lewis invited. "The day after tomorrow, I have a meeting with someone to discuss cooperation tomorrow." Okay. These past few days, Doris had been getting along with him very pleasantly. The man had an extremely high emotional intelligence, and his fondness for her was evident in his eyes without the slightest concealment. This comfortable feeling was 1,000 times better than when she had been constantly giving in front of Brian before. At the same time, Brian arrived in the city where Doris was located. As soon as he landed, he immediately had someone investigate Doris's current situation. In the evening, Brian looked at the information in his hand, his handsome face unusually gloomy. The investigation materials showed that Doris and Lewis were currently living together. The two of them left home together in the morning and returned together in the evening, practically inseparable. Brian read through the documents several times, then abruptly threw them onto the desk. Fortunately, there was no mention of them having registered their marriage. He still had a chance. Come to think of it, it's only been a few days. Doris wouldn't be that impulsive. At that moment, Brian found the president of the Michelle Family Group and struck a deal with him. Michelle Family Group president will take him along when he goes to the Fitzgerald family to discuss cooperation tomorrow, and in the future. He will backstop the Michelle family's development domestically. The next morning, Brian deliberately put on a handsome grey suit and dressed up from head to toe. He checked the mirror several times, making sure everything was perfect before heading out. Fitzgerald Group. Doris finished the morning meeting. The secretary reminded her, "Ms. Doris, the president of the Michelle family has a 10 a.m. meeting scheduled and is waiting for you in the small conference room." Okay. Doris took a sip of black coffee, picked up the documents on the table, and walked towards the small conference room. In the conference room, Brian sat nervously. He looked at the photo of Doris on his phone's lock screen, his dark eyes filled with nostalgia. Soon, the sound of high heels came from outside the door, and the conference room door slowly pushed open. Brian felt the entire world fall silent as he gazed expectantly at the woman before him. She wore a sleek black professional suit dress. Her hair neatly tied up, a gentle yet resolute smile gracing her delicate face. Doris frowned slightly, not yet processing what was happening, when the man suddenly embraced her, the scent of mint washing over her. Brian held her tightly, his voice trembling. "Doris, I've finally found you." Doris grew impatient and was about to push him away when Lewis, who had come early to deliver fruit, pulled Brian away first. The next second, Lewis pulled Doris behind him. He looked at Brian, his sharp black eyes flashing with a hint of coldness, the murderous aura emanating from him extremely dangerous. "Brian, you've done so many things to hurt Doris. How do you still have the face to appear before Doris?" Brian was stunned for a few seconds, just about to explain that he had mistaken her identity from the beginning, when Doris said with a cold face, "Wait, Lewis, let me clear the area first. This is the Fitzgerald family's group, and this floor also has her employees." She didn't want her personal matters to become public knowledge. As she spoke, Doris looked at the silent Michelle family president, her face cold. "Mr. Michelle, from now on there will be no more business dealings between the Fitzgerald family and the Michelle family. Please see yourself out," Lewis said with a cold expression. "The Colbert family will withdraw their cooperation with the Michelle family. Don't let the door hit you on the way out." The president of the Michelle family turned deathly pale. The secretary then made a gesture of invitation. Soon, only Doris, Lewis and Brian remained in the office. Brian looked at Doris sitting next to Lewis. His gaze fell on Doris's cold, indifferent face, and his heart felt as if gripped by a hand, aching sharply. In the past, Doris would always look at him gently, her watery eyes filled with love for him. Brian thought for a long time before finally saying, "Doris, I've already taught Ethel a lesson. Will you come back?" Lewis let out a light scoff. Darren's family really are all thick-skinned. How dare they have the nerve to ask for reconciliation? Doris looked at him coldly and said calmly, "We're over. I assume you've seen that farewell letter?" Brian asked with reddened eyes, unwilling to accept it. "Don't you have any love left for me at all? It's gone." Doris looked at him expressionlessly and replied calmly, "From the moment I found out you secretly donated my bone marrow to Ethel, I stopped wanting to love you. The following 7 days were my desensitization period. The moment I wrote that farewell letter, I never wanted to see you again." Thinking carefully, Brian was the first man she had loved with all her strength, influenced by her parents' loving relationship. Her simple-minded nature led her to subconsciously believe that if she treated him with sincerity, he would reciprocate with sincerity in return. To say she never loved Brian would be a lie. After all, she had endured the difficult 5-year period of disability alongside Brian, stubbornly persevering through it. But just as she was about to enter into marriage with Brian, this man repeatedly hurt her for the sake of Ethel. No one could accept all these things that have happened recently. She even feels somewhat disgusted by him now. Doris clearly didn't say anything harsh, yet Brian's face grew increasingly pale. "Brian, no matter how much you beg me now, I won't turn back. We've already missed our chance between us. From now on, let's just be strangers." Doris finished speaking without looking at Brian's expression, then took Lewis's hand and left the conference room. Brian watched Doris's resolute retreating figure and thought about getting up to chase after her. But the secretary stepped in front of the door first, and Brian could only stand there, watching helplessly as the two of them left. All day long, Lewis stayed in the office with Doris. In the afternoon, when Doris got off work, Brian drove after her relentlessly, but Doris pretended not to see him the entire time. In the evening, the butler approached Lewis and Doris with a tablet, hesitantly saying, "Sir, madam, there's a man kneeling at the entrance of our villa, holding a stack of documents. No matter how much we try to drive him away, he refuses to leave." Doris glanced at the surveillance feed on the tablet. Brian was kneeling at the doorway, holding a stack of car purchase contracts in his left hand and a small sign in his right. On it were written 18 characters, "Doris, I ordered 3 sports cars you like. Please forgive me." What was even more exaggerated was, behind him, 2 others were holding up a banner. On the banner, a line of text read, "Give me another chance, okay? Please throw me an ex-revival armor." Doris frowned slightly, feeling completely unmoved. "Don't bother with him." The next morning, the weather suddenly turned gloomy, and a torrential downpour began. Brian was completely drenched, looking utterly miserable. Without a trace of his usual aloof and dignified demeanor, Doris quickly slipped into Lewis's car after stepping out. In front of the villa, Brian watched helplessly as the Porsche drove away, his dark eyes filled with desolation. In the past, whenever he was even slightly down, Doris would be extremely anxious. But now, after he had been drenched in the heavy rain all morning, Doris didn't even glance at him. In just half a month, Doris's attitude toward him had changed significantly. Fitzgerald family group. Doris finished her morning meeting as usual, and the secretary walked in with a car purchase contract. Doris's fair little face showed a trace of irritation. She thought it was Brian being annoying again. But the secretary smiled and placed the car purchase contract in front of her. "Ms. Doris, this was sent over by Mr. Lewis. Her phone suddenly vibrated. It was a message from her best friend Lilith. "Little Doris, Lewis is really something. He even called me specifically to ask what kind of sports car you like." I straight up said the ridiculously expensive Pagani, and he didn't even blink before placing an order. He's genuinely serious about you. Doris took a photo of the car purchase contract and posted it on her social media with the caption, "The car is cool, and so is he." In the afternoon, Lewis took Doris to take wedding photos together. Brian followed them into the wedding studio, staring at Doris with red eyes. "Doris, why won't you accept the car I bought you?" "But you accepted his car." Doris stared at the somewhat aggrieved man before her and smiled sarcastically. "Because I said I never want to see you again. So naturally I don't want to accept anything from you either." "Brian, didn't you always want to marry Ethel and have children? Now that I've made room for Ethel, shouldn't you quickly marry her?" It was only later that she realized, while she was taking care of the disabled Brian was still sending money to Ethel who was abroad. Such deep affection moved her deeply when she heard about it. Brian's dark eyes dimmed, as if they had lost their light. He stepped forward, wanting to embrace Doris. "Doris, it's all Ethel's fault. She deceived me into thinking she was June, which is why I mistook her for you and treated her well all these years. Now I know the truth, whether in my youth or now, the one I've always loved is you. I forced Ethel to have an abortion a few days ago and punished her. Can we start over?" He paused, his voice tinged with a sob. "Think about how happy we used to be." Doris drifted for a few seconds, remembering the old days, actually. At first Brian's mom looked down on her and didn't approve of her being with Brian. Brian's mom wholeheartedly hoped Brian would find a girl from a similar social background, but she always wanted to try her best to get closer to the one she loved. In those past days, she had always lived with unease. She was always worried that she wasn't good enough to Brian and couldn't keep his heart. She always worried that Brian would rekindle his old flame with Ethel. She always worried that Brian's mom would dislike her. Doris took a step back, avoiding Brian's touch, her face cold. "Brian, whether Ethel deceived you or not, you're fundamentally not a monogamous person. You've been disabled for 5 years, and I've taken care of you for 5 years. Over these 5 years, even if I haven't achieved great merits, I've certainly put in hard work. But after you recovered, Ethel returned to her home country due to illness, and without discussing it with me, you secretly donated my bone marrow to Ethel. Your actions are truly despicable. You're actually quite ruthless and selfish. You simply don't value my life as life. You orchestrated these things behind my back, and then proposed to me afterward, all because you wanted to have 2 women at the same time. Tell me, how could I possibly still love someone like you who doesn't even qualify as a real man?" Brian opened his mouth, wanting to say something, but couldn't utter a single word for a long time. His shoulders slumped, his whole body in a wretched state, like someone who had been cast aside. Doris paid no further attention, turned around, and went in with Lewis to take their wedding photos. In the evening, Doris received a video call from Lilith. During the video call, Lilith pointed at the local news on her computer. "Doris, did you see? The Horace family is involved in a huge scandal." Ethel watched the video on the local news headline, "The Horace family faces bankruptcy. Mr. Horace sells daughter for businesses." Lilith shook her head and clicked her tongue twice. Ethel's father is really ruthless. The Darren family cut off business dealings with the Horace family, and several major companies that partnered with the Horace family followed suit by withdrawing their investments. Now, the Horace family is left with nothing but an empty shell. Although Ethel's dad's abilities were lacking, he was a ruthless man. To secure the Horace family's position, he actually came up with the idea of selling his daughter, publicly announcing a starting bid of $1 million, with the highest bidder winning. I heard that after Ethel found out, she tried to escape several times, but each time she was caught and brought back by Ethel's dad. Doris lowered her gaze, her voice faint. "Heaven has eyes, evil begets evil retribution. She is not pitiful at all, Ethel. The suffering she endured because of Ethel a while ago was far worse than the current desperate state of Ethel. If she hadn't been lucky, she might have ended up lying in the hospital forever because of the bone marrow donation." Meanwhile, Brian still refused to give up. To win back Doris, he created a live streaming account and broadcast every morning from 9 to 11. The theme of the live stream, "Winning Back My Ex-Girlfriend," Darren's family CEO livestreaming to win back his wife. Once this news broke, the number of viewers in the livestream soared to 100,000. Some uninformed netizens were curious about how the two had broken up. To show sincerity, Brian explained in detail the reason why Doris left. After netizens learned about it, their reactions were completely different from what Brian had expected. Very few offered advice for Brian, most were standing up for Doris. To be honest, I'm on Doris's side this time. What Brian did would be unbearable for anyone. Arth, so infuriating. Why do I have to come across this kind of stupid live stream first thing in the morning? Madman and madwoman, they should just lock themselves together forever, or go die. The comment section was full of people cursing. Brian had a livid face but gritted his teeth and finished the 2-hour broadcast. The next day, netizens were already waiting early for Brian to start his live stream. Unexpectedly, Brian announced right after starting the live stream that he would reward 1 million for each piece of good reconciliation advice from netizens. As soon as these words were spoken, netizens were initially skeptical, but then they remembered that Darren's family had always been known for their deep pockets. Netizens quickly shifted from their sarcastic and critical tone of the previous day and began offering suggestions. In my opinion, she's been deeply hurt by you. The only way for you to truly understand her feelings is to go through everything she has experienced. That's right. Just punishing Ethel is useless, you're actually one of the accomplices too. In my opinion, there needs to be a formal apology, only then can it be considered a real apology. Brian carefully browsed through the netizens' suggestions and selected 5 that he felt were feasible. For the next half-month, Brian did not go live. At first, netizens thought Brian's attempt to reconcile was just a whim, but half a month later, Brian started streaming again. In the live stream, Brian's appearance gave the netizens a fright. He had a bandage wrapped around his head, his face pale and bloodless, as if he had endured immense suffering. It turned out that during the half-month he disappeared, he had gone through all the grievances Doris had suffered. After experiencing all this, Brian was filled with deep regret. He looked into the camera with reddened eyes. I finally understand why Doris was so determined to leave me. I really let her down. His actions earned him some respect from netizens who were initially dissatisfied with him. The tone in the comments section took a sharp turn. Though there were still a few who weren't buying it. Brian is, after all, a top-tier alpha CEO. The fact that he's willing to go to such lengths to win his wife back, I respect him as a real man. How many wealthy men aren't playboys? A man who comes back is a good man. Doris should forgive him. I disagree. I have inside information. Ethel has done plenty of dirty deeds over the years, and it's always been Brian cleaning up her mess. Meanwhile, during those years, it was Doris accompanying the disabled Brian, which means Brian was two-timing very early on. The final comment was soon buried among tens of thousands of comments. Some netizens began shipping Brian and Doris. Brian still goes live every day, and the internet is flooded with clips of him talking about his loving past with Doris during his streams. All of this is seen by Doris. She never expected that Brian would try to use public opinion to pressure her into getting back together, so she created a new social media account. That day, she made an official announcement. The photo showed her and Lewis's marriage certificate. The caption read, "Something to do, someone to love, and something to look forward to." The moment these official wedding photos were shared, they instantly shot to the top of the trending charts. Brian was in the middle of a live stream when he noticed the comments section going wild with messages. Doris and Lewis have officially announced their marriage. Wait, that can't be right. Isn't Lewis famously known for keeping his distance from women, the untouchable flower on the peak? Oh my God. Lewis also made an official announcement. He said he's so happy to marry the person he wanted to marry when he was young. How romantic. Brian felt as if struck by lightning when he saw the comments. His mind went blank for a few seconds before he tremblingly picked up his phone and clicked on the trending topic. The moment he saw their marriage certificate, it felt like a bucket of cold water had been poured over him, leaving his entire body as cold as an ice cellar. But he still refused to give up, insisting to the live stream camera, "She was just acting on impulse. I'll wait for her to get divorced." By evening, these words had reached Lewis's ears. Previously, he knew Doris had long lost any love for Brian and had allowed him to fool around online as he pleased. But Brian's statement about waiting for her to divorce made Lewis decide that very night to publicly declare war on the Darren family. The Liu family announced that any company that voluntarily terminates its contract with Brian can negotiate and sign a contract with the Colbert family. Brian also began to secretly compete, drastically lowering base prices in some businesses opposing the Colbert family. The actions of the two instantly sparked curiosity among people in the circle. Many families have started to gossip behind the scenes. I heard it's over a woman, now the two families are going at each other. It's a bargain for those small companies. But the Colbert family has always been gentle and refined. This is the first time they've done something like this. If your own wife was about to be taken, wouldn't you be furious? The conflict between the two prominent families had escalated into a major uproar. And it wasn't long before Grandpa Darren became aware of the situation. Furious, he left the nursing home and immediately chartered a private jet, storming straight into Brian's office in Country A. At that moment, Brian was on the phone, competing with Lewis for a partnership with a particular company. The company wasn't particularly large, yet the two of them were locked in a subtle but intense rivalry. Grandpa Darren walked into the office, picked up his cane, and struck Brian with it. "You bastard, for a woman, you've caused such a mess." The last shred of dignity left between the Colbert and Darren families over the years has been completely torn apart by you. Grandpa Darren was so angry that his chest heaved, and he nearly couldn't catch his breath. His health had been poor since last year, and this year he moved into a nursing home, gradually relinquishing power to the younger generation below him, especially Brian, as his most beloved grandson, was placed with high expectations and held the greatest authority. Over the years, even during his period of disability, Brian's achievements were something his peers could never hope to reach in their lifetime. Yesterday, upon hearing about the things Brian had been doing lately, he nearly fainted from anger. Brian lowered his head slightly, his dark eyes tinged with a trace of sorrow. "Grandpa, I'm sorry, but I don't want to give up on Doris." Bang! Grandpa Darren narrowed his murky eyes fiercely and struck Brian with his cane once more. Having held a high position for a long time, he was usually reticent, but now he spoke at length. "Kneel down. It's true that our Darren family and the Colbert family have been sworn enemies for a century due to our ancestors' feud, but it was only in business and personal relations that we ceased all contact. Never before has it been as awkward and embarrassing as it is now. How dare you bully the Fitzgerald family's girl like this, making it known to everyone? Where do you expect me to put my old face?" These past few days, Brian has been sleeping no more than 2 hours a day in his struggle against Lewis. The consecutive blows left him dizzy and weak in the legs, nearly causing him to pass out on the spot. Brian ignored the pain as he walked up to Grandpa Darren and knelt down, pleading, "Grandpa, could you help me arrange a meeting with Doris? She has a soft heart. If you invite her, she'll definitely come out." Grandpa Darren looked at his proud grandson kneeling before him for the first time, his clouded eyes flickering with complex emotions. "What if the condition for me to invite Doris out is to strip you of your position as the heir of the Darren family? Would you be willing?" Brian didn't hesitate for a moment and nodded. "I do." Grandpa Darren took a deep breath and, under Brian's expectant gaze, nodded, "Okay." Brian kowtowed 3 times in a row. As soon as he stood up, perhaps due to consecutive sleepless nights and the beating he had endured, he instantly fainted. You should know that Brian used to have an extremely strong physique. How could he faint after just a few strikes with a stick? Grandpa Darren ultimately couldn't bear to see him suffer any longer. He waved his hand, signaling the butler to rush Brian to the hospital immediately. Brian, after fainting, he felt as if he had entered a dream. In the dream, he traveled back 5 years. When Doris accompanied him to Lingxian Temple to make a wish, Brian suddenly embraced Doris, who was in the middle of writing her wish on a slip of paper, and anxiously said, "Doris, I'm taking you to get our marriage license right now. How about we hold the wedding tomorrow? I don't want to marry you. You'll betray me. I'm making a wish now to never see you again, not in this life or the next." Brian's tall frame shuddered violently. He grabbed her hand, his eyes red as he pleaded, "I won't betray you. I've changed." He wanted to reach out and hold Doris, but Doris stepped back a few paces, let out a cold laugh at him, and then vanished into a wisp of smoke. Brian cried out in overwhelming grief. This was the first time he had truly felt a heart-wrenching pain. After a long while, he slowly opened his eyes, and the pungent smell of disinfectant assaulted his senses. Grandpa Darren glanced at him, his voice hoarse. "I've spoken with Doris on the phone. She said she can meet with you, but only if you bring Lewis along. However, she's unavailable these next few days. She only has time at noon 3 days from now." After a pause, Grandpa Darren narrowed his cloudy eyes, his entire presence radiating an aura of authority that commanded respect without anger. "Are you sure you want to go see her? If you agree, I will publicly strip you of your heir position right now. Brian, you're emotionally unfaithful. Unable to let go when you should. Someone like you isn't suitable material to be an heir." This was Grandpa Darren's second time asking. Even though Brian knew the consequences of his stubbornness, he still insisted, "Grandpa, I want to see her. I'll die without her." Okay, that night, Grandpa Darren publicly announced that Brian was no longer the heir of the Darren family. Doris was having dinner with Lewis when she received the news, and Lilith called. "Doris, have you heard the gossip? Grandpa Darren just publicly announced that Brian isn't the heir. It seems old man Fu is completely disappointed in him." Doris lowered her gaze slightly, pausing her soup-drinking motion. Grandpa Darren had completely set aside his dignity when he called her this morning. He first apologized for Brian's behavior and for his own actions, then sincerely expressed hope to meet with her in person, so that Brian would completely give up. Doris was well aware that the current situation between the Darren and Colbert families had become utterly disgraceful. If she didn't step in, the relationship between the two families would likely continue to deteriorate, so she agreed to Grandpa Darren's request to meet Brian on the condition that she could bring Lewis along. Doris lowered her gaze slightly and said softly, "I heard that when old Fu was young, he single-handedly turned the declining Darren family from loss to profit. Naturally, he has his own remarkable way with people." On the other end of the phone, Lilith quite agreed. "Here's another piece of gossip. Ethel's father recently sold Ethel for $7 million to a nouveau riche in his 50s, who has a beer belly and a mouth full of yellow teeth. Ethel was forced to register her marriage with the nouveau riche. I heard she had several breakdowns on the day they got the certificate, causing such a scene that the police had to be called. To be honest, netizens captured photos of her crying in front of the Civil Affairs Bureau, weeping so pitifully and delicately that it tugged at everyone's heartstrings." Doris hadn't even spoken yet when Lewis beside her picked up a piece of braised chicken wing for Doris, his thin lips curling slightly. "Pitiable people often have hateful traits. She may cry pitifully now, but there will be more tears for her in the future." The meeting was scheduled for 3 days later, and Brian wasn't idle either. To demonstrate his determination to make amends, Brian had a lawyer draft a contract for transferring all his real estate and luxury cars. All Doris needed to do was sign it, and all his assets would be transferred to Doris. He then studied Doris's preferences, quietly doing his homework. By the time he finished all this, it was already the 3rd day. Brian got up early to dress up and accompanied Grandpa Darren to the appointment. In a private room of a 5-star hotel, Brian gazed eagerly at the door, holding a Bugatti purchase contract in his hands. The waiter opened the door, and 2 tall figures walked in. Doris and Lewis walked in hand, both dressed in low-key matching grey outfits, radiating happiness from head to toe. Doris, after sitting down, gave a slight nod toward Grandpa Darren. Brian looked at Doris's indifferent face, feeling as if something had gripped his heart, the pain making it hard to breathe. Since when had she stopped smiling at him? Brian took out the transfer contract, along with a handwritten page detailing Doris's preferences, and said in a hoarse voice, "Doris, look, I've really changed for the better. I'm sincerely asking to get back together. Can you believe me one last time?" Doris glanced at the piece of paper Brian had handwritten. She picked it up, quickly tore it apart, and looked coldly at Brian. "This paper is torn to pieces now. Can you go back to the way you were before?" Brian clenched his hand and spoke tremblingly. "Everyone makes mistakes. Can't you give me a chance to turn over a new leaf? I don't want to anymore. You're not worth it." Doris spoke very calmly. Remembering what happened a month ago, she said lightly, "Brian, I truly loved you once. But now I truly don't love you anymore." She appeared gentle on the surface, always prone to compromise in temperament, but once she made up her mind about something, she wouldn't change it. Even if, had she not met Lewis after leaving Brian, she would have chosen to live alone. Brian grew increasingly pale. Doris continued, I truly hope that, for the sake of the 5 years I took care of you, you will stop bothering me. Let's really not see each other anymore. After speaking, Doris didn't look at Brian's expression anymore. Her gaze fell on the silent Grandpa Darren. Grandpa Darren, I've said what needed to be said. Lewis will no longer take any actions against the Darren family, and I ask that Grandpa Darren remember what you promised me. That day, Grandpa Darren called her and asked her to come meet Brian. She actually made 2 requests in total. One was to bring Lewis along. The other is the hope that Grandpa Darren will keep Brian in check and stop him from pestering her. Grandpa Darren lowered his cloudy eyes slightly, a trace of regret surfacing in their depths. He had lived most of his life and had always been a good judge of character. If Doris were to marry Brian were to secure his position as the heir, the Darren family would undoubtedly rise to even greater heights. It's a pity that Brian was not destined for this. Grandpa Darren took a large red envelope from his bag and handed it to Doris. Sweetheart, happy wedding. This is a little something from me. Doris looked at the red envelope before her, her watery eyes tinged with a hint of red. During the 8 years of dating Brian, aside from Grace, Grandpa Darren was one of the very few elders in the Darren family who genuinely accepted her from the bottom of his heart. Doris took the red envelope and replied neither arrogantly nor humbly, thank you. Grandpa Darren, my apologies, but I have matters to attend to and must take my leave now. Grandpa Darren nodded, ultimately unable to hold back a sigh. Outside the private room, Doris hadn't walked far when Brian stepped out from the room. He looked at Doris's retreating figure and called out loudly, Doris, can we hug one last time? Doris frowned, about to coldly refuse. A figure suddenly dashed out into the hallway. Ethel saw Doris, her face contorted, and she strode forward, splashing concentrated sulfuric acid directly onto Doris's face. Lewis frowned deeply and wanted to run over to block it for Doris, but he had been communicating with the waiter about paying the bill and was too far away. Brian, seeing this, he took a big stride and used his body to block Doris. The concentrated sulfuric acid instantly splashed onto Brian's back and head, rapidly corroding his skin. Excruciating pain surged through him, and even the usually tolerant Brian couldn't help but let out a scream. Doris was stunned for a few seconds, then walked up to Ethel and slapped her face, swelling it. Ethel, are you insane? You actually threw concentrated sulfuric acid at someone. If it weren't for Brian blocking it for her, she would be the one disfigured now. Ethel covered her swollen, red cheek. She looked unwillingly at the injured Brian, her voice trembling slightly. Why did you take the hit for her? I only wanted to splash her, not you. Doris frowned, raised her hand, and slapped Ethel hard across the face once more. Just wait. The Darren family won't let you get away with this, and neither will I. The ambulance arrived quickly. Brian was loaded into the ambulance. With reddened eyes, he looked at Doris, his voice weak. Doris, after this, can you forgive me? Ethel looked at the bleeding Brian, about to speak, when Brian heavily passed out. 3 days later, Doris received the news that Brian was not doing well. At the time, Brian had shielded Doris, and the back of his head was drenched with concentrated sulfuric acid. He was admitted to the hospital with a severe infection and has been in the ICU ever since. Just as Doris had expected, Grandpa Darren did not spare Ethel. He hired top lawyers and sued Ethel in court. Meanwhile, Doris made a special trip back to Los Angeles. She called the maid as a witness and sued Ethel for intentionally throwing a vase to harm her. Doris was ultimately sentenced to 30 years in prison. After such an incident, Doris had no heart to prepare for the wedding. Lewis could understand her and publicly announced the postponement of the wedding. A few more days passed. Doris received a call from Grandpa Darren. On the other end of the line, Grandpa Darren's aged voice carried a slight tremble. My dear, come see Brian one last time. He's not going to make it. Doris, her mind went blank for a few seconds, and she stared blankly at Lewis beside her. Lewis, seeing her helplessness, he held her in his arms and comforted her. Go see him. No matter what he did before, he saved your life back then. If you see him this time, you won't regret it later. Along the way, Doris gazed out the window, her mind a complete mess. She no longer loved Brian, and had even resented him before. Yet this time, he had saved her. In a private hospital room, Doris looked at Brian lying on the hospital bed, his entire body gaunt as dried wood, his face pale without a trace of blood. Even breathing was very faint. When he saw Doris, Brian suddenly smiled. It was the first time he had smiled in days. He motioned for Doris to come closer, patted her hand, and said in an extremely weak voice, "Doris, don't cry, I'm sorry, I was wrong before, and I sincerely apologize to you now. Don't blame yourself for my leaving. If you could, would you hold me one more time?" Doris bent down, gently embracing Brian, her voice hoarse. "Don't die. Grandpa Darren still needs you." Brian let out a light laugh, his gaze shifting to Lewis outside the window before turning back to Doris with reluctance. "Happy wedding. My Doris, I sincerely wish you everlasting happiness." Doris finally walked out of the hospital room in tears. Lewis stood in the corridor, holding her trembling. Crying form, "You shouldn't blame yourself, it's not your fault." That evening, Darren's family issued an obituary announcing the news of Brian's passing. 3 days later, it was Brian's funeral. Doris and Lewis attended together. In the crowd, the two were dressed in black. Doris looked at Brian's coffin with reddened eyes and said, "After you're reincarnated, find a better girl. Brian, I wish you happiness in your next life." 6 months later, Doris and Lewis held their wedding ceremony. The wedding venue was entirely decorated in a racing theme. Lewis had meticulously prepared for 2 months. For this wedding, Lewis went along with Doris's idea. He didn't invite any business associates, only close friends and relatives. When the bride and groom were toasting in turn, Lewis's mom looked contentedly at Doris in her wedding dress and gently patted her hand. "No need to rush to have children. Lewis specifically told us the other day that if you don't want to, we shouldn't pressure you." Doris turned her head and looked at the handsome man beside her. The man was dressed in a black suit with sharp, handsome features. When he noticed her gaze, he gave her a gentle smile. Doris felt a warmth in her heart. "Mom, we'll take it as it comes." Doris walked over to Doris's mom, who was holding a small handkerchief and had long been crying uncontrollably. "When you were 3 years old, Mom already thought this day would come, but now that it's really here, Mom still can't bear to part with you." Even the usually calm and composed Doris's dad had reddened eyes at this moment. Doris looked at her parents, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Lewis was very considerate, choosing a marital home very close to her family's house, just a 10-minute drive away. Left with no other choice, she could only say, "I'll come back home to stay for a few days every month from now on." That same day, the news of the Fitzgerald and Colbert families' wedding instantly shot to the top of the trending searches. Netizens have been sending their blessings on social media. "Woo woo, I heard that Mr. Lewis was Doris's crush from her younger days, so envious." But it's also because Doris had the courage to cut her losses in time. That 8-year toxic relationship, if it were anyone else, it wouldn't be so easy to just let go. "Mr. Lewis is so warm and considerate. I heard the wedding venue was decorated exactly how Doris likes it." Another day of envying someone else's relationship. Upstairs, "Mr. Lewis is throwing money on the other platform. Hurry and enter the password to grab it." A week later, Lewis accompanied Doris to the prison where Ethel was held. After communicating with the warden, Doris soon met Ethel. Ethel was wearing loose prison clothes. She had lost weight, with sunken eyes and heavy dark circles. The once envied long black hair had now become frizzy and dry. Ethel, seeing that the visitor was Doris, felt a surge of anger. She looked Doris up and down, desperately trying to find a sense of superiority over Doris. But the Doris before her looked radiant. Under Lewis's loving care, she exuded one word from head to toe: happiness. Ethel could find no fault with any detail of Doris's well-being. She dug her nails into her palms, her face filled with resentment. Why? She was going to prison for 30 years, while Doris lived freely and well. Noticing Ethel's jealous gaze, Doris held up the recent Fitzgerald family report, showing it to Ethel through the glass. "See, after a year of my hard work, the Fitzgerald family has turned a profit." After a pause, she took out her phone and opened the wedding photos from a week ago with Lewis. "Lewis and I got married. I should actually thank you for that. Without you tirelessly and relentlessly sharing TikTok videos, telling me all the things Brian did for you, I might not have been so determined to leave him." Span TSK, "Who would have thought I'd end up marrying my teenage crush?" When netizens found out we got married, they all sent nothing but blessings. Span, Doris said in a tone full of playful pride. Lewis turned his head to look at his young wife. his handsome face filled with adoration. How had he never seen Doris with this maddeningly cheeky side of hers before? His young wife was truly adorable. Ethel was so jealous her eyes were practically spitting fire. In her eyes, Doris had always been inferior to her. It was only because she had gone abroad and discarded Brian that Doris had seized the opportunity to briefly have Brian. But why would such an ordinary woman have Brian willingly block concentrated sulfuric acid for her, and Lewis want to marry her? Ethel narrowed her eyes and scoffed lightly. Doris, no matter how much you show off, you can't deny one thing. It's me who received your bone marrow, and that's why I'm alive and well now. When the night is deep and all is quiet, every time you think about this, you probably get so angry you can't sleep, right? Lewis, his dark eyes were tinged with a flicker of anger. Just as he was about to lose his temper, Doris grabbed his hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. Immediately after, she smiled and looked at the smug-faced Ethel behind the glass. Since you have no conscience at all, I'm relieved. I heard you were bullied in prison. If I happen to meet that chubby female inmate later and put in a word about you. Doris hadn't even finished speaking when Ethel turned deathly pale. She stared at Doris and screamed, "You dare!" Doris turned her head to look at Lewis, and the two exchanged a knowing smile. Before coming to the prison, they had already done their research. Ethel was not doing well in prison. After learning that Ethel was imprisoned for splashing Brian with concentrated sulfuric acid and harming the person who had once donated bone marrow to her, the female inmates began to isolate Ethel, and the chubby female inmate's favorite pastime was forcing Ethel to perform imaginary car racing. "Didn't you call yourself June? Show me how you race cars." Ethel would always get up to perform in tears whenever she was called upon. Doris curled her red lips into a bright smile and said, "Of course I dare, Ethel. You must live well, I'll come visit you every few months." With that, Doris ignored the loud protests from Ethel behind her. She turned to speak with the warden, wanting to visit a female inmate. That night, Ethel was given an extra challenge while performing an imaginary car race. The female inmate scolded her. "Ms. Doris said that June can do a dragon tail whip and even overtake on curves. Come on. You claim to be June, show me." 3 years later, Doris gave birth. Lewis waited outside the delivery room, holding a bouquet of sunflowers. 5 hours later, the baby was the first to be wheeled out by the nurse. Lewis didn't even glance at the baby, and even Lewis's mom didn't look at the baby either, anxiously grabbing the nurse's arm to ask, "Where's my daughter-in-law?" The nurse, seeing a mother-in-law so concerned about her daughter-in-law for the first time, was momentarily taken aback before saying, "Don't worry, both mother and child are safe. The mother is right behind." It wasn't until Doris was finally wheeled out that Lewis hurried forward, looking at the pale and weak Doris on the hospital bed. He, for the first time, had tears welling up in his eyes in front of her. "Doris, I'll go get a vasectomy tomorrow. We won't have any more children from now on." Lewis's mom also had reddened eyes, wiping her tears as she said, "Yes, no more. It's just too much suffering."